Good evening, everybody.
Kavotov, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, I made you wait. I'm sorry. I just fell asleep. I was on my chair here. Yeah, it looks like we're on Hey and Vav. So here we already did the tour. So I'm just reading the Bit Yosef. It talks about the issue of how to tie them up together, how to bind them, the binding, not using strings made out of flax. Okay, so says the Bet Yosef regarding this. Perek Bet Megillah, right? What's the source for this? Second Perek Megillah, second Yutet Amud Aleph. Rashi explains. Nikret Sefer. It's called a book, as we said, right? Nichtab Sefer. The Katav Arosh. It's written with a book, whatever that means, as a book. The Katav Arosh as the Rosh. Peresh Rashi explains. Shem Rosh HaTefer Ad Makom HaTefer. תפילה אגיד כממנו עד הגיד השני, וכן מן השני לשלישי, right? So as we already said, right, yesterday, this means that the distances are equal between one binding and the other. וכן מן השני לשלישי, כמו מן השלישי עד סוף התפר, וכפירושו מצינו במכות. So it says, just like Rashi, we find also in Makot in Tet Amud Bet, Gabe Are Miklat, regarding the cities of refuge, the Amrina and Hatam, because we said there, Veshilashta, right? It says that there's also, regarding the cities of refuge, there has to be equal distance between one city and the other. Shehu Meshulashot, Shehe Midarom Lechavron, כמחברון לשכם, ומשכם לקדש, כמקדש לצפון. So what he's telling you is like this, right? That all these cities in the cities of refuge are also equidistant, one from the other, going from north to south, going from the northern edge of the country, and then getting to the northernmost city, right? And then going from there to the middle one, and so forth and so on. So they're all equidistant from one from the other. So same thing applies, right, to the bindings of the Megillah. Okay, so then he goes on. והריף כתב, it says the riff, right, it says, שאם הטיל בה ג' חוטי בגדין, that if you put three strings made out of sinews, right, שניים בשני קצות היריעה, what does that mean? You're going to have two at the two ends, right, one on the top, one on the bottom, ואחד בתוך היריעה, and one in the middle, בלבד שהוא משולשים, and they also have to be, as we said, right, equidistant, פירוש שבתוך היריעה. So he says the way you explain it is that um, the one in the middle, it should be in the middle of the, as we said, right, the middle of the parchment, whatever the, yeah. So he says we also find, right, the equidistant in this kind of manner. Where is that in Eruvin? Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. Gabe Shlosha Kifarim Meshulashim, right? We're talking about about three villages, right? Also that have to be equidistant. Ube Bechorot, also, and this is Bechorot, Lametet Amud Aleph, Gabe Mumim, regarding blemishes. Interesting. Yukap Kevan, the Ashkechan Tre Gavne Meshulashim. So he says, since we find two types of that equidistant, whatever, איש לחמיר, יש לחמיר, במגילה להטיל בה גידין כשני הפירושים. So he says, therefore, the proper thing to do with the Megillah is to be machmir like both explanations. This way you can, for sure do the right thing. So he says, how do you do that? You take 5 strings, right, which are made out of sinews. Ad kan leshano, that's the end of it. וכן כתב המורכי, that says the מורכי, וכך הם דברי רבנו, and also the Tur. והווה יודע, so he says, you should know, שהרמב"ם מפרש דמשולשין, היינו, שצריך לתפור. So right, the Rambam explains that משולש, right, as we said, right, equidistant, is that you have to do the binding שלושה תפירות בראש העירייה. That means you have to do 3 bindings, right, at the top of the the parchment. ושלושה בסופה, and 3 at the end. ושלושה באמצעיתה, and 3 in the middle. ולפי זה, אם באנו לצאת ידי כל הפירושים, so he says, therefore, if we're going to try to now fulfill all these, right, I believe, these opinions, צריך לתפור י' א' תפירות, so we'd have to do 11 bindings, right, שלושה בראש העירייה, 3 at the top, ושלושה בסופה, and 3 in the middle. I'm sorry, 3 at the other end. ושלושה באמצעיתה, and 3 in the middle. ותפילה אחד בחלק הרביעי, and you're going to have then, right, 1 binding on the 4th part of it, the 4th, yeah. מצד זה, it says, ותפילה אחד בחלק הרביעי, מצד זה. So it's, yeah, so in other words, on the 4th, it says, on the 4th part, you're going to have one on the top and one on the bottom. Okay, interesting. So that's how he explains it here, the Beit Yosef here regarding that. So let's see Shulchan Aruch how he explains this, right? Bottom line. Okay, so it says, Im tafra bechute pishtan pesula. So the only thing it really says is like this, right? That if he sewed it with with flax, strings made out of flax, it's pasul. So what does that mean? That means you have to use sinews, just like you do on the Sefer Torah. All the more so, by the way, that means that you couldn't use things like some nylon or whatever, right? Something like that. Obviously, that wouldn't do the trick because that's not any different than nylon. Than I'm sorry, than the flax. Okay, there's no commentary on this one, by the way. Interesting. Nothing there. Okay. Right, but there's one more Shulchan Aruch here, which goes on, right? To that was only the first part. So, what does that mean? That was something we learned yesterday. That you're not supposed to use the flax. So here the Shulchan Aruch says in Vav, im hitil ba gimel chutei gidin, right? It says if he put three uh, strings made out of sinews, kshera, it's kosher. Bivad sheyu beshulashot. But as we said, right, they have to be equidistant there. So what does that mean? They have to be evenly spaced out, right? Even spacing. מפני שיש בו פירושים שונים. So he says, but the thing is that, as we just saw, right, that there's several opinions about how that looks. So, practically speaking, right, what do you do? So it says, צריך לצאת ידי כולם. So you try to fulfill the obligation of, try to fulfill the opinion of all of them. That's what we do, right? Like, as we said in the Bet Yosef. So what does that mean? ועשה שלושה תפילות בראש בגימל בסופה, בגימל באמצעיתה, right? So as we just said, right, in the end of the Bet Yosef, the way to fulfill all the opinions is to do 3 on top, 3 on the bottom, 3 in the middle, בגימל באמצעיתה, ותפילה אחד בחלק הרביעי, and then on the fourth part, we do one there on the top. And the same thing on the bottom, right? And the fourth part, another one there. Okay, there you go. So that's exactly what we just saw in the Bet Yosef. If you have any questions, let me know, by the way. Okay, so says in the Ramah here, ואם אין לו גידים יותר, מוטב לתפור הנשאר בחוטי. So it says, let's say he doesn't have any more, right, sinews, the ones that are used for the Sefer Torah, those. So what does he do? So he says, better to use to sew the rest of them, right? To bind the rest of them. בחוטי פשתן מלהניחו בלא תפירה. So it says better to use flax than to do nothing, right? To have nothing there. Interesting. Yeah.
In order to compensate for the missing, no? In this case.
What we're saying is, again, right, I'll say it again. I'm not sure if you understood maybe what I said, but what happens is, right, he's lacking, right? Yeah, he's short, Yeah, so he's short. So what he does is he does those last 2 ones, which he doesn't have. Better to do them in flax than to do nothing.
Okay, thank you.
אבל אם יש לו גידין, יתפור כולה בגידין. But it says right in Ramah, but if you do have enough sinews, then you should do everything with sinews. That's the best way to do it. והתפירה תהיה מבחוץ ולא מבפנים. So it says also the binding should be on the outside and not on the inside. Interesting. In other words, it's like on the visible side, on the outside, where you see it, right? And not on the inside where you don't see it. Okay, interesting. That's the Ramah. Okay, so I think we're finished with that topic. Let's go to the next one. So here, right, says the Torah, וצריך להניח שיעור בראש היריעה. You have to leave, right, the word shiur means like a remainder, like a leftover, right? Like a whatever, right? Overmeasure. You got to leave over some overmeasure there at the top of the what do you call it? The page. And also at the end as well, So there has to be some slack there on top and bottom. Kishetofran biyachad when he binds them together. Shelo yitfor hakol. So what does that mean? Don't bind everything. U'mashu sagi. So it's enough to leave over a little bit, right? So that means that there has to be a little bit on top and bottom, which is not bound, right? A little slack there. Okay, so that's the tour. So it says, "Bet Yosef, the Sefer Torah bainan hachi." So it says we also require this in the Sefer Torah as well. Kedeita beperek sheni Megillah, like it says in the second perek of Megillah. V'tama kedei shelo yikra v'lamed Rabbeinu Megillah b'Sefer Torah v'zel Hashem amor achi. So he says, right, that the reason why we do that, to leave over some slack, is because this helps it not to rip. So you know why that is? Because if you don't leave any slack and you pull on it, it'll rip right away. But the fact that you leave over some slack, allows you to pull a little bit without having to actually rip it. Because it has some space, to bend a little bit, right? To give way. Yeah.
So essentially, Kavod Harav, if it's too tight, it could rip the
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
yeah. So it says, but it's not really a matter of tightness over here. We're talking about there's slack on the top and the bottom, So it gives some leeway to bend.
The space, no?
You understand? In other words, we're not talking about how tight you make the strings. That's not the issue.
No. It's the in between the strings and the the and the Megillah, no? And the
In other words, there's some space left over that's not bound, right? That's basically what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to, when you look at it, you'll see what that means exactly. I mean, if you haven't seen it, whatever. But I think it's pretty clear what that is. If you have a little experience with scrolls and books, you've probably seen this kind of thing with binding.
Okay.
Also, you'll find also the same thing with notebooks, like
Yes.
things like this, yeah. Folders,
Yes.
notebooks, that you have to leave some slack over on the top and bottom
Mm-hmm.
where it's not bound there. The end of the page is not bound. Okay, so he says, right, that the truth is that he learned this from the Sefer Torah because that's where the source is for this idea. So it says, "V'zeh lashon ha-Mordechai." That's what it says in the Mordechai. Mesapek alan says we have a doubt. Do we require also, right, the same thing, that slack, when it comes to Megillah, just like we require with Sefer Torah, right? Usfarahi debainan et ad kaneshino. So he says it makes sense to say that we do require that. In other words, it's just logical, you know. So even though we don't have like a Talmudic source for this, you know, regarding the Megillah, but it just like we kind of like move it over from Sefer Torah. We adopt it from there. Okay, that's the Bet Yosef. So here also, right, Shulchan Aruch says the same thing, very concise. It says, "Tzarich le'aniach shiur berosh ha'iriyah b'safah." You have to leave some slack over, right, on top and bottom. Kishetofram yachad, when you bind them together. With mashu sagi, even a little bit, right? That's good enough. Okay, that's Zain. Now we're going to Het. Right, so this is an important piece, halacha, this one, because, you know, a person could easily err when it comes to something like this. But today, nobody does this. But anyway, right, just to be on the safe side, you have to know this halacha, because otherwise, you know, definitely could make a mistake here. So it says, right, it says in the Tur, "וצריך שתהא כתובה לבדה, שלא תהיה מחוברת עם הספרים." So, right, the thing is that the halacha says in the Tur that you have to make sure, right, that you have a scroll which is only Megillah there, nothing else. There's no other book, right? Another one of the holy writings there, you know, the prophets or whatever, right? They cannot be mixed up together. So the Megillah, a kosher Megillah, has to be only Megillah, nothing else there. That's what we're saying. So I'm reading inside the Tur, right? It says like this: "V'tzarich sheyeh ketubah levada," has to be written by itself. "Shelo teheh mechuberet im asfarim," shouldn't be mixed up with any other book. "Ve'im ha'im mechuberet imahem," and if it is connected with another book, v'kara ba b'yachid, if he read it as an individual, yatzah, he fulfills obligation. So in other words, let's say he has like this, you know, one of these at home, and it also has some other scrolls there, you know, besides the Megillah. For instance, usually, right, what is written together, you have Megillah, and then you have also like Ruth, you know, the book of Ruth, and then you have the book of, right, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. These are often put together, you know, bunched together in like one book, one scroll. So if it was at home, you know, you're doing it as an individual, you fulfilled your obligation, b'diavad. Sheteh niglelet kesefer Torah. But it has to be, right, in a scroll form, right? So what does that mean? It can be rolled up, right? You know, like a sefer Torah. But tzibur, when it comes to community, lo yatsa, he didn't fulfill obligation at all. Ve'im yeriotea odafot me'at. So it says if it's what do you call it? If its pages, right, are a little bit larger than the rest of the book, al shara more than the other pages, right? Shebesefer or chaserot, or they're a little bit smaller, one or the other, right? Either it's a little bit larger or a little bit smaller. So then, even with the tzibur, even in the community, right, he fulfills obligation. So why is that, right? What does that matter? Because once you have, right, a distinction like that, where it's larger, or smaller, that makes it like into separate book, kind of. So that therefore, right, this is the reason why it works like that. Then he goes on. Right? It says the bet hey, right? Balalachot zal ha de amrinan that which we say, but tzibur lo yatsa, that within community he didn't fulfill obligation. Perush be bet knesset, that means in a synagogue. Shu makom tzibur, it's a communal place, right? Ubai pesum enisa. So there we require publication of the miracle. It nisa אבל שלא בבית הכנסת, but if it's not in the synagogue, אפילו ביוד, even if you have a minyan, right, let's say in your house, יצא, he did full obligation. ולא נראה, so it doesn't seem right, he says. דכל יוד מקרה ציבור, because he says every time you have a minyan, that's called ציבור, that's called community. לכל דבר, right? So in other words, he's telling you, according to his opinion, it doesn't matter whether you're in a synagogue or you're at home, it's the same thing. ואין חילוק אם הם בבית הכנסת או לא. Therefore he says there's no difference whether they're in the synagogue or some other place. ואם אין מגילה כשרה, יש מתירים לקרותה בחומש. So right now, okay, that's already something else. We'll get to that later. But let's first read this in the Bet Yosef. So he says, so he says the source for this, בפרק שני the Megillah, it's in the second parak of Megillah. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, right, says this rabbi. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right, the name Rabbi Yochanan. הקורא במגילה כתובה, בין לכתובה לא יצא, ומחו לעמוך בציבור. בין הכתובים, right? So it says right like this, that if you're reading a Megillah, which has also other books there, you didn't fulfill your obligation. ומחו לעמוך בציבור, right? And they explained that, they qualified it. It means when you it means that you're reading in the community. Amocha b'tzibur shanu, right? Umikme haki amina natam. So there, because of this, we said there, Amud Aleph, ha de lo yatsa amarava lo amru, that which they said, they didn't feel the obligation. They only said this ela de lo mixra, right? Umiatra. That's only when it's not bigger or smaller, as we said, right? Purta, the pages are not bigger or smaller. Mixra umiatra, but if it is, Purta letlan ba, right? Then we don't care. It's okay. It's fine. Rashi explains haketuvah min haketuvim, that it's written amongst other books. Sefarim shehayu b'mei chachamim. We're talking about those books, right, that they had in the time of the rabbis. Kulam begilayon kesefer Torah shelanu. All of them in one scroll, like a sefer Torah, as we said, right? Lo yatzah, didn't fulfill his obligation. Debainan igeret latzma, because we require that it says igeret, right, which is called a letter. So that's usually something which is by itself, right, not with other works. The mifarsam nisa tefei. Why is that? Because he says this way the miracle is publicized more. The fact that you have a special book just for that purpose, The chikor ben aktuvim nireh kekoreh bikra. Why? Because if you're reading it with all together with other books together in one scroll, it looks like you're just reading Bible. Oh gee, yeah, you're reading Bible. Isn't that nice? People don't understand. This way, that's something unique here, that we're reading the Megillah because we're commanded that night to read the Megillah, that day, right? Whatever. So that's the reason why we don't want that, he says. Interesting. Okay, that's Rashi. let's go on. So he says, Mixera or miat, right? As we said, right? Unless it's larger or smaller, then it's okay. Aruka mishal kilafim. So as we said, right, that means that it's larger than other the other pages, lemala or lemata, whether it's above or below, or ktsara mem, or either it's longer or shorter. V'yeshla heker le'atzma. So therefore, it's recognizable by itself. It's different. The Katabaran says the Ram regarding this. Umachu le'amocha lo amru ela betzibur. So he says, right, that's only regarding the community, right? That's how they qualified it. Yesh mefarshim lo amru lo yatsa ela betzibur. Some say that means that they only said this regarding, when you're community, that you need full obligation. But b'yachid, when it comes to individual, yatsa, he did full his obligation. That's one way of saying it. That's how the Rif explains it. Velishna lo mashma achi, but he says the language is not implied like that. Interesting. The ken havale lemimar, because otherwise they should have said hanemile betzibur. That's talking about when you're with a community. But b'yachid, when it comes to an individual, yatsa, it fulfills obligation. They should have said it like that if that's the case. But since it used this language, right? Mashma shehem mechalishim koach hadavar. So it implies that they're actually making it even weaker. In other words, they're being stringent. Right? It says, therefore, it seems that he's saying like this. That you should only say that in full obligation. You shouldn't say this only with the community. You should not say that. Right? But even when it comes to individual, even lechatchila, it's okay. So he says, therefore, even with the community, right, but the avad, they did fulfill obligation. So it seems like he's being more lenient, actually, right? This opinion than the first one, because according to the first opinion, you didn't fulfill your obligation even by the avad, in the community. Okay. Good. So then he goes on. But the Rambam says, right, that when it comes to the community, right, even b'diavad, you didn't fulfill the obligation, which is the way we understood it originally, right? Right? So it seems like they all agree, right? The Rambam and the Rif and the Rosh, that we go the Chumrah here, right? Stringent. So what does that mean? That when it comes to the community, even b'diavad, you didn't fulfill obligation. If you have a scroll like this, Gamken ve'achin yaktin, and it says that's halakha. It says Bet Yosef, right? These Rishonim. Okay, so then he goes on. Katav balai tur zal. Says the Itur. Had aminan betzibur lo yatsa perush bebet haknesset. As we said, right, that the Torah brings that opinion that it's only talking about the synagogue. So regarding that, says the Bet Yosef, Tamo mishum de afal gav de asara mikru tzibur. So he says the reasoning is like this: that even though 10 people is all called a tzibur community, whether wherever they may be, shem hayinu le'inan kiddush v'kedusha. That's regarding the kaddish and kedusha, v'kiyotzev and things like this. The achal be asara sharia shechinta. Why is that? Because anytime you have 10 people, right, the shechina is there, the divine presence is there. So usually, right, the condition that makes it into a community is having 10 people. So then, what does that have to do with the synagogue then? When it says, when it comes to publication of miracles, though, he says, right, according to this opinion, if it's not in a synagogue, it's not really such a big publication. So he says, therefore, it's considered to be like an individual. So the idea is like this, right? That since the community assembles in the synagogue, to do their communal work, and that's where people find out, oh yeah, they're in a synagogue, they did this, they did that. everybody finds out about it. So it's like more publication, more publicity, So therefore, according to this opinion, it has to do with the fact that it's a synagogue. But I think we already said, right, the halacha is not like that. Okay, so we're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch, right, how he paskins. So says Shulchan Aruch like this: En korin betzibur megillah ketubah ben ketubim. As we said, right, you shouldn't really read the Megillah in a scroll which has other books in there. Ve'im kara lo yatsa, right? And b'diavad, if he read it, he didn't fulfill obligation. Elam ken hayta yetira al shara yetirot, unless it's larger, right, as we said, or chesira, or smaller. Kedei sheyeh la heker, that it should be recognizable. Aval hayachid koreba, but he says when it comes to the individual, he can read with it, right? Afilu ena chesira or yetira, even if it's not larger or smaller. And he does full obligation, but dafka keshehi ketubah begilayon kesifra Torah, right? That's only if it's written on a scroll, right? You can't use one of these, right? Paperbacks, whatever, right? Even if it's parchment, you can't use that. So it has to be written in a scroll form, which means it's rolled up, rolls up like a scroll. Well, you know what that looks like. I don't have to tell you. Okay, so that's the Shulchan Aruch Het. So let's go to Tet. So he brings here in the Bet Yosef, Katav Rashba, right? Tshuva, the Tshuva of the Rashba, Al Megillah Shehi Nekuda Mechamat Nikud Enu Ro'eh Shetipasel Bechach. So he says, right, that this seems to be brought from the Torah. Yeah. Maybe not. No, maybe not. This is not in the Torah. But anyway, right, he says like this. He brings the Rashba. It seems like it's not in the Torah. So the Rashba says, right, what about if they wrote a Megillah with vowels, right? Is that kosher or not? So what about Sefer Torah? Do you know what the rule is, right? If you write it with vowels, it's not kosher, right? Even b'diavad. So here the Rashba is saying, right, that when it comes to the Megillah, it is kosher, Katav od Megillah sheyesh b'daf harishon brachot piyutim. Another thing he writes there, the Rashba, is if you have a Megillah, and the beginning of the Megillah, right, you have the blessings, which are said, and also some songs, whatever. Davar pashut shehik shera. It says pashut. It's clear that it's kosher, right? Adkan. That's the end of it. The Mordechai Katav Pek Bnei Yair. It says the Mordechai. B'Shem Abi Ezri, name of Abi Ezri. Then nichtov berachot b'Megillah. You shouldn't write the blessings in Megillah. The itkash the Sefer Torah, because it's just like the Sefer Torah, right? It's always we try to use the same rules, for Sefer Torah, as we do with the Megillah. Why is that? Because, right, as we said, the Megillah is called a Sefer. So therefore, we try to translate the rules, right? Transfer the rules from one to the other. So, just like the Sefer Torah, you really shouldn't have the blessings there. Same thing also with the Megillah, he says. So he seems to argue with the Rashba. ולא דמה למגילה כתובה בין הכתובים, right? So this is not just a regular letter, some kind of regular scroll, right? עד כאן יש לנו לציין. ואף על פי שנראה מדבריו, דמפסיל נמי פסיל, so says Bet Yosef, right? Even though it seems that from his words, that it's pasul, even bediavad, something like this. So he says, La al divrei Rashba, yesh lismoch leachshira bediavad. So he says, but bediavad, we can rely on the Rashba, So therefore, right, if there is a Megillah like this, you can, bediavad, it's kosher. That's what he says. Okay, let's go to Shulchan Aruch here, 9. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch, Megillah shehi nekuda, right? Megillah, which is has the vowels, right? It's got the dots, right? As they call it, right, the dots. V'chen im katav ba b'daf harishon brachot u'piyutim, right? Also, if he wrote in the first page, right, at the beginning there, the blessings, and also all kinds of songs, right? It's not pasul. So, right, the paskins like the Rashba, right? But that's only bediavad, So really, the truth is, lechatchila, you shouldn't write a Megillah like this, which has, which has the vowels or the blessings, all kinds of things like this. It should be just a Megillah by itself, and that's the way it is today. By the way, nobody writes the Megillah with any of this stuff, right? With vowels and things like this, blessings. You won't find a Megillah like that because everybody knows that this is like it's a question mark. This the whole thing, right? So people don't do it. Okay, so right, but B'diavad, as we said, right, it's kosher. So if you do have a Megillah, right, with the vowels, you don't have to throw it away. You don't have to bury it, right? You can keep it. Okay, very good. So I guess we'll stop there. I apologize, for the lateness. Just fell asleep, It was, I guess I'm overtired. I have to really rest a little bit. So I'll get some rest tonight. We'll see you guys tomorrow. B'ezras Hashem. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak Baruch.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
Okay, pray for our soldiers. They had some trouble last night. Shem Yirachem. There was some problems over there. Hashem should save them, and help them to succeed. Amen. Amen.
Amen.